The Cold War. Much of the world lived in fear of nuclear war. Anti-communist sentiment ran high in the United States. Soviet citizens were cut off from the Western world. Relations between these two superpowers would chill and thaw for 4 decades. From Yalta in 1945 to Malta in 1989, summit diplomacy, coupled with pre-summit negotiations, was an important factor in bringing the Cold War to a peaceful end. Summitry has been deemed successful at times. Other meetings have been criticized as failures. The outcomes depended heavily on personalities, political relationships, and timing. Undoubtedly, the consequences have changed the world. The lasting impact of summitry has reached beyond the borders of the US and the former Soviet Union. The term summit was coined by Winston Churchill during the dark days of the Cold War. He remarked, "Matters could not be worsened by a parley at the summit."
The summit meetings, they did achieve things because once the leaders were meeting, it gave them a chance to talk directly to each other.
Several of the 24 such meetings best exemplify the successes, failures, and consequences of Cold War summitry. World War II. The Big Three alliance consisted of the US, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain. Wanting an unconditional surrender by Germany, Franklin Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin, and Churchill met in the USSR in February 1945. The setting was Yalta, an isolated town on the Crimea.
Roosevelt saw the Yalta Conference as a way of reinforcing détente, or a détente relationship with the Soviet Union that had developed during World War II.
The results of the Yalta Conference were mixed. Many Americans felt that Roosevelt had too quickly conceded control of Eastern Europe to Stalin. Roosevelt and Churchill wanted what was best for the alliance. Stalin wanted what was best for himself. But Churchill's interpreter, Hugh Lungi, recently said that it is wrong to speak of these countries being handed over to Stalin at Yalta. Stalin already had them physically. The Soviet partition of Poland was especially contentious. Decisions at Yalta would contribute to the start of the Cold War a few years later. The most positive results of the Yalta Conference were the strategies that would help end the war in Europe later that year.
One of the accomplishments of the Yalta Conference was that the Big Three, actually, they were able to save the alliance despite the cracks that were clearly appearing in that alliance over Eastern Europe, over Poland. That was certainly a success.
After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the Big Three met one final time in Potsdam. They laid the groundwork for a divided Europe. But any goodwill between the US and USSR would not last long. The Iron Curtain was about to drop. Political and physical barriers were cemented by the early 1950s. Tensions and distrust grew between the two superpowers. The world feared that either nation might drop the atomic bomb. In 1961, the Berlin Wall was a literal and figurative symbol, separating East and West. A newly elected president, John F. Kennedy, headed into the Vienna summit with the recent failed Bay of Pigs invasion weighing on his mind. Premier Nikita Khrushchev arrived at Vienna in June 1961 with little intention of negotiating. The Soviet leader issued ultimatums about Berlin, Cuba, and missiles. Kennedy concluded the tense talks by observing that it would be a cold winter. Few would argue that the face-off at Vienna was anything other than a diplomatic failure. Vienna seemed to confirm that summitry often was counterproductive and that dealing with a dictator was just too risky. Due to foreign relations disasters, especially the Cuban Missile Crisis, summitry was unsuccessful until Richard Nixon took office. In 1969, Leonid Brezhnev and Nixon agreed to a practice of détente, hoping to ease strained political relations.
But from the mid-late 60s, I think they were steadily improving. More contacts were developing at the political level, at the level of the economies, and even at the level of the societies.
In 1972, Nixon made a well-received visit to China. Many supported his efforts to improve diplomacy with the USSR. At the Moscow summit later that year, Nixon and Brezhnev signed an anti-ballistic missile treaty and the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. For the first time, both countries agreed to decrease nuclear arsenals. In 1973, they met to sign an agreement on atomic energy. Although appearing to be successful negotiations at the summit, much of the actual dialogue took place ahead of time. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger and Soviet officials created a back-channel negotiation. But relations would deteriorate not long after these landmark agreements. Nixon was embroiled by political crises at home. Soviet-backed insurgencies grew in Latin America, Indochina, and Africa. Dialogue with Moscow came to a halt. The diplomatic policy of détente quickly declined. U.S.-Soviet symmetry was placed on the back burner for the next decade. On Christmas Day 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. An outraged President Jimmy Carter declared boycotts of trade in the 1980 Olympics. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan denounced the Soviet Union as the evil empire. Although a staunch advocate for a strong defense, he believed a nuclear war should never be fought. Mikhail Gorbachev shared this belief. When he became General Secretary in 1985, he wanted change. Both wanted to talk, aware it would not be easy. At the 1985 Geneva summit, a spirit of glasnost, or openness, was pervasive. Gorbachev failed to convince Reagan to end the Strategic Defense Initiative. No arms compromise would be reached. Instead, the biggest success was summit diplomacy itself. Open dialogue had begun in earnest. The rapport, boosted by cooperation among advisors and diplomats, started a chain reaction that would help bring a peaceful end to the Cold War through a groundbreaking series of summits. But there would be difficulties. In 1986, they met in Reykjavik. An arms control package seemed within reach, but the SDI remained an obstacle. Reagan refused to give up the ground and space-based systems. Gorbachev was frustrated but hopeful. He said, "Despite its drama, Reykjavik was not a failure. For the first time, we can look over the horizon." Following the Iran-Contra affair, Reagan's administration needed a foreign relations success. The next year, Reagan issued a challenge.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
At the 1987 Washington summit, Reagan and Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. America liked Gorbachev, and the feeling was mutual. Soviets gave a warm welcome at the 1988 Moscow summit. The two superpowers had built a trust that enabled them to use symmetry as an effective form of diplomacy. Moreover, symmetry had greatly improved public receptiveness to open discussion on both sides of the Iron Curtain. When asked in Moscow about the evil empire, Reagan admitted his views had shifted due to Gorbachev's leadership. Of the 5-year summit series, Reagan simply said, "I think we have held some very productive meetings." Gorbachev and George H.W. Bush met in the choppy waters off of Malta in December 1989. This summit was more symbolic than substantive. A month earlier, the Berlin Wall had been torn down, due in large part to Soviet-American diplomacy. By this time, arsenals of nuclear arms had been reduced by over 40%. At Malta, the two discussed a rapidly changing Eastern Europe. The Iron Curtain was lifting. Within a few years, the Soviet Union would dissolve and new borders would open.
Broadly speaking, the period after the end of the Soviet Union saw an increase in democracy around the world and a spread of democracy that has had largely beneficial consequences.
20th century U.S.-Soviet summit and pre-summit diplomacy had a significant impact on the way nations conduct dialogue. Historically, the consequences of symmetry have turned on personalities and political climates. Symmetry in the 21st century will have global consequences. In a rapidly changing world, discussion among many leaders, and not just between two superpowers, will be crucial to breaking down barriers. Mistakes have been made. Mistakes have been undone. Decisions at Yalta were successful in that they helped end the war in Europe. Yet there is no doubt that Yalta also fueled the fire for the Cold War, resulting in 4 decades of tension. Face-to-face symmetry by motivated leaders in the right place at the right time helped end the Cold War. From Yalta to Malta, summit diplomacy has, at its worst, built walls. At its best, it has torn those walls down.